The most expensive wars are often the ones you cannot see. They do not begin with declarations, they begin with silence. Right now, off the coast of Venezuela, American ships are moving. Small boats are being destroyed. More than 100 people are already dead. And yet, when Congress asks a simple question, how much is this costing? The Pentagon says almost nothing. Democratic lawmakers estimate the bill is nearing $1 billion, about $800 million in Caribbean operations, another $500 million tied to an effort to arrest Nicolás Maduro, but there is no official number, no clear accounting, no public reckoning. I want you to pause here, because this is not just about money, it is about power. If you care about accountability in a democracy, this story matters. Stay with me, because to understand what is happening offshore today, we have to understand why the numbers disappeared in the first place. And that takes us deeper. At its core, this story is not about Venezuela. It is about a system under strain. Congress holds the power of the purse. That is not symbolism. That is the spine of American democracy. Yet here, lawmakers ask for costs. They receive deflection. Rep. Adam Smith says estimates point to $800 million already spent. Caribbean strikes. A military buildup that began in August. Another estimate adds $500 million more. An operation aimed at arresting Nicolás Maduro. Together, the number approaches $1 billion. The Pentagon responds by minimizing, by saying it isn't costing anything. That response changed the crisis, not because it convinced anyone, but because it signaled defiance. If costs do not exist on paper, they cannot be challenged. This is where the tension sharpens, because when costs vanish from the record, oversight weakens, and when oversight weakens, power shifts. To understand how we reach this moment, we have to step back into history, into cycles, into the mechanics that make secrecy possible. This did not begin overnight. American power has a pattern. Crisis appears, forces deployed, oversight lags behind. In the Caribbean and near Venezuela, that cycle returned again. The military buildup began in August, quietly, incrementally. Ships repositioned, operations expanded, boat strikes escalated, no formal war authorization, no clear public budget line. This is how modern military action often works, not through one dramatic vote, but through accumulated decisions, each small enough to avoid attention, each justified as temporary, until the costs compound. By the time lawmakers ask questions, the machinery is already moving, and stopping it becomes politically expensive. This is the structural loophole. Operations framed as pressure, not war. Spending framed as marginal, not massive. Yet the numbers tell another story. Hundreds of millions, lives lost. Once you understand this mechanism, the next explosion feels inevitable. Because systems built on silence eventually produce crisis. And the first one has already arrived. Then came the moment when silence broke. Not with a speech, not with a vote, but with bodies. More than 100 people killed in Caribbean boat strikes, small vessels, asymmetric targets, barely visible on a radar screen. This was no longer abstract, no longer procedural. It was lethal. And suddenly the estimates mattered. $800 million, Democrats say, tied to these operations. That number reframed everything, because it revealed scale and intent. This was not a symbolic show of force. It was sustained. It was operational. It was expensive. When Adam Smith pressed for answers, the Pentagon dismissed the question. It isn't costing anything. That response changed the crisis, not because it convinced anyone, but because it signaled defiance. If costs do not exist on paper, they cannot be challenged. This is the first breaking point. When violence escalates and transparency retreats, if you want to understand how democracies drift, this is the moment to pay attention. Because what comes next is never accidental. It is designed Behind this crisis sits a quieter architecture, the system that allows force without clarity. Military operations today are rarely labeled as wars. They are framed as missions, as enforcement, as pressure. That framing matters, because once something is not called a war, it escapes the rituals of war. No formal authorization, no clear appropriations debate, no single line item the public can point to. The Pentagon can say it is not costing anything because costs are absorbed, dispersed across accounts, buried inside readiness budgets and deployments that would exist anyway. This is the hidden mechanism. Ships are already funded, troops are already paid, so moving them offshore becomes invisible on paper. But invisible does not mean free. Every redeployment has opportunity cost. Every strike consumes material. Every extended operation compounds risk. And when Congress cannot see the bill, it cannot exercise its constitutional role. That is why Sen. Jack Reed calls this lawlessness, not because of ideology, but because the system is slipping its constraints. Once that happens, the second crisis is no longer a question of if, only when. The second rupture came not from the battlefield. It came from a promise. President Donald Trump said the costs would not matter because Venezuela's oil would pay for everything. It sounded simple, almost elegant. Pressure the regime, take control of the oil, let the resources fund the force. But systems punish fantasy. Oil industry experts said the truth out loud. It would take $60 billion and several years just to make Venezuela's oil industry functional again. That reality collapsed the narrative. In a private meeting, executives hesitated. The CEO of Exxon used one word, uninvestable. That word triggered another shock. Trump threatened the company, said he was inclined to keep Exxon out. Markets reacted immediately. Exxon's stock dropped. This was the second crisis, not military, economic, a collision between political ambition and financial reality. The idea that oil could magically erase a near $1 billion military bill was exposed as illusion. And when illusions crack, confidence follows. Investors hesitate. Institutions recoil. The pressure strategy now carried a new cost, one measured not in ships or strikes, but in credibility. And that cost always lands somewhere else, usually on people who never voted for it. Now, let me turn to you, because systems do not fail in abstraction. They fail in lives. When $800 million disappears into operations you never voted on, that money does not vanish. It is money not spent elsewhere. It is equipment stretched thinner, oversight weakened, trust eroded. You are told this is distant, offshore, foreign, but secrecy has a domestic cost. When Congress cannot get answers, neither can you. When accountability fades at the top, it fades everywhere else. This is how democracies slowly hollow out, not with coups, but with temporary missions that never end. You feel it when institutions sound defensive instead of transparent, when officials dismiss questions instead of answering them. That unease you sense. It is rational, because once violence is normalized without clarity, citizens lose the ability to judge policy at all. If this matters to you, pay attention, share the questions, demand numbers, because silence only protects power. It never protects people. And what happens next does not stop at the Caribbean, it spreads. What happens offshore never stays offshore. Power radiates outward, so do consequences. The Caribbean is not isolated. Neither is Venezuela. When U.S. forces escalate quietly, other actors watch carefully. Allies read the signals. Adversaries study the gaps. If Congress can be sidelined here, it can be sidelined elsewhere. That lesson travels fast. Regional stability bends. Energy markets react. Diplomatic leverage shifts. An operation nearing $1 billion without transparent authorization does not just strain budgets, it reshapes expectations. Other governments learn that force can precede explanation, That accountability is optional if framed correctly. And when economic pressure is paired with military ambiguity, global investors hesitate. The Exxon episode mattered for that reason, not because of one company, but because it signaled risk, political risk, regulatory risk, personal risk. Capital does not like uncertainty, it flees it. And when capital pulls back, entire regions feel the drag. This is how a regional operation becomes a global variable. The world does not just see American power, it measures American discipline. And right now, that measurement is unstable. To understand where this leads, we have to look forward, not with certainty, but with scenarios. There are three paths from here. None of them are abstract. The first is restraint. Congress forces disclosure. Costs are named, limits are set, operations slow, pressure shifts back to diplomacy. This path restores trust, not because power disappears, but because it is bounded. The second path is drift. No numbers, no votes, no correction. Operations continue in the shadows. Spending grows quietly beyond $1 billion. Public attention moves on. This is how temporary missions become permanent realities. The third path is escalation. Economic pressure fails. Oil does not pay the bill. Credibility erodes further. Force expands to compensate. More ships, more strikes, higher costs. This is the most dangerous path, not because it begins with intent, but because it emerges from inertia. Systems default toward force when accountability weakens. That is the lesson history keeps teaching. The future will not be decided by ideology. It will be decided by structure. Whether oversight functions, whether numbers matter, whether silence is rewarded. Because once systems normalize unaccountable power, they rarely stop on their own. And that brings us to the final question. What do you do with this knowledge? This story does not end with the number. $800 million, $500 million, nearly $1 billion. Those are symptoms. The real question is simpler and more uncomfortable. Who decides when force becomes routine? In a functioning democracy, that answer is not silence. It is debate, disclosure, consent. What we are watching off the coast of Venezuela is not just a military operation. It is a test of whether oversight still means something, whether numbers still constrain power, whether citizens still get to judge policy before it hardens into fact. History shows us this clearly. Power rarely announces when it crosses a line. It normalizes it quietly, incrementally, until one day the line no longer exists. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay engaged. Follow this channel, share this conversation, because the next chapter will not begin with an explosion. It will begin with another unanswered question, and if we stop asking, the answer will be decided for us. This is not the end of the story. It is the opening frame of the next one.